The message I'd like to share with you this morning is entitled, Lord, couldn't you send someone else? And that's exactly how I felt on Tuesday. Couldn't you send someone else? Don't choose me when I'm not good enough to take on the role you're asking me to do. Choose someone better, just as the prophet Moses experienced a wrestling match of emotions when God said go. So might we when we're asked to do something we don't feel ready or able to perform. Such as talking to people about the Bible and what we believe can even be challenging, can't it? We ask the Lord every day to give us an opportunity to spread Jesus, then sometimes it's hard to open up your mouth and say anything, isn't it? And sometimes, often in the back of my mind, I think, I don't want to be where the Lord says, who are you? And ashamed because I wasn't willing to share him. One day he might not have kind words for me. Not that we do God's work to aim kudos and blessings. We do it because the Lord has instilled in us a love, his love in us to want to love and share it with others. So might we when we do something we don't really feel ready to perform, just as Moses felt. We look in the mirror and see only our faults and shortcomings, as Moses felt. But we can be grateful that God views us in a much different light. He sees us through a kaleidoscope of promises placed inside us at conception. He sees us through Jesus. As our Creator, God knows the full range of our talents that he gave us, and yet he's also aware of our disabilities and why we feel afraid. Moses focused on one aspect of the task, speaking, while God saw a much bigger picture. He understood the hardships and challenges ahead for this mighty leader. He knew that Moses was not a skilled speaker, but also knew that it was not Moses' speaking ability that would lead God's people through the wilderness, but it was his faith and obedience that God would use to guide the multitudes out of Egypt. The writer Sherry Fuller tells a short story in a devotion. She said, I remember approaching the noisy classroom of an inner city school, my first year out of college, facing 30 rowdy high school boys, most of them taller than I was. And seeing a desk fly out the window as I walked in, I thought, Lord, couldn't you send someone else to deal with these students? They were a formidable group of teens for a young and inexperienced teacher like me to handle. And that's the way we feel, isn't it, when we're on our own, when we haven't asked the Lord to be with us. Let us turn in our Bibles now and we'll read the account of what happened with Moses. So if we turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 3, and part of the scripture reading came from this today too. Exodus chapter 3. Now Exodus is the second book in the Old Testament, and we're going to read quite a few verses as to what happened with Moses. First of all, when this happened, Moses was about 80 years of age, and he lived to 120. So he was not a young schoolboy, was he? So he'd had 40 years in the palace in Egypt, and then 40 years as a shepherd in Midian. Well, shepherds were not considered a great occupation, but they were not held in very high esteem, although it was a very important job. Well, how on earth had Moses landed there? Well, as we all know the story of the bulrushes basket in the river where Moses' mother placed him and his sister Miriam looked on, and this was when the Israelites were under captivity in Egypt, and because they were afraid, or the then king at the time was afraid that the Israelites were multiplying too much and there were getting too many of them and they might overthrow the Egyptians, he put out a law that all male children had to be destroyed at birth. Pretty horrible law, wasn't it? But this day the princess, the actual king's Pharaoh's daughter, was bathing in the river, and she saw this basket floating by. And she got her servants to go and get it, and she looked inside, and there was a beautiful 3-month-old child. And she decided that she didn't want that baby to die. So she actually said, and Miriam, Moses' sister, who'd been watching on the sideline, said, this baby will need, or the princess said, this baby will need feeding. We need a wet nurse. So Miriam, under I'm sure God's plan, said, we will look after the baby. I'll find an Israelite woman to look after this child. And of course it was Moses' mother. So the child was saved and didn't die. And Moses actually stayed, I believe, with his mother until he was about 12, and she schooled him in her belief and trust and love of God and brought him up a very lovely young man. But eventually she knew she had to give him up. And just to summarise, he went to court when he was about 12, and then he came under the care of the Egyptians. His mother, of course, was a princess, and he was schooled highly as a young man in the forces, in the army, and also in his education. So he was highly educated. But things don't always work out as we plan, do they? So one day when Moses was a young man and he was walking out in the town, he came across an Egyptian belting into an Israel young man. And he was incensed that this man was actually thrashing this young Israelite. So he took it upon himself to actually kill the Egyptian. And he quickly buried the evidence and thought nobody had seen. But of course someone always sees, don't they? And the next scene, of course, was when 2 Israelites were fighting, and he tried to break up that fight. And then he got a shock when they said, I suppose you're going to murder us like you murdered the Egyptian. So he suddenly felt then he had to get away, because he knew that the Pharaoh then would want his life for the Egyptian's life. So now we'll take up the story in the Bible. Where is Moses now? This is chapter 3 and verses 1, and we'll go right through until, I think I've got 12. Exodus 3, 1 to 12. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro. This is where we find Moses. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now Moses had actually, during this 40 years as a shepherd, met a young woman married, and he had 2 children. And of course his father-in-law was the priest of Midian. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire. But the bush was not consumed. What a strange sight. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Verse 7. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, What is his name? Who shall I say? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am have sent you to me. Now let's turn to chapter 4 and continue the story. We're going to read 10 to 16. Chapter 4 in Exodus 10 to 16. Then Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. So the Lord said to him, Who has made man's mouth, or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what to say. But he said, O Lord, please send by the hand whomever else you may send. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? And as we know, Aaron was the elder brother. I know that he can speak well, and look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. So he shall be your spokesman to the people, and he himself shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as God. Sometimes that's how we feel, isn't it, when the Lord asks us to do something? We think, why? Why? But we need to put ourselves in the position of not knowing why, but to answer agreement that if the Lord's willing to use us, we need to be willing to accept what he will help. Sister Ellen, the prophetess Ellen White says in the book Patriarchs and Prophets, Moses became the great leader of Israel through obedience to God's instructions. She says, a man will gain power and efficiency as he accepts the responsibilities that God places upon him, and with his whole soul seeks to qualify himself to bear them aright. However humble this position or limited his ability, that man will attain true greatness, who, trusting to divine strength, seeks to perform his work with fidelity. She also says the divine command given to Moses found him distrustful and slow of speech and timid. He was overwhelmed with a sense of incapacity to be a mouthpiece for God to Israel. But having once accepted the work, he entered upon it with his whole heart, putting his trust in the Lord. When we choose to obey God, remember, God knows what you're capable of, and then he uses the ordinary to perform the extraordinary. He is the one who gets the praise and honour. Remember, God can enable you as well when you obey him. Just as a silver urn can be used to hold fine wine, so can a common crockery. It's what is on the inside that matters, not on the outside. To complete the story of Sherry Fuller, she said, God gave me strength and even a love for my challenging students. I learned things during that difficult year that I've used throughout my ministry of speaking, writing and instructing teachers and parents. Sometimes God's work might seem impossible, but the Lord asks you to do it. So we need to move ahead in God's strength, isn't it, and do what he's asked you to do. Sister White always also says in sharing the vision, God's servants should daily gain more knowledge of him. They should grow in grace and spiritual understanding, strengthening with might according to his glorious power. The Lord can do amazing things with people, can't he? And as I stand here, almost unbelieving that I'm standing here at all. For those who've known me a long time, I was very shy when I first started to attend church with my husband and children. My husband was an elder in the church. My sister-in-law, as you know, Leonie Duff, is a very learned older woman now. And my father-in-law had been a pastor. So who could this silly little nurse who just trained at Wahroonga Hospital do in a family like that? And I'd come from Warburton, and I'm sure some of you know all this anyway, but I repeat it, where I had been the only student to get a position at the Wahroonga Sydney Adventist Hospital on that year. Because what had happened is we'd had some young people go to the SAN and they'd misbehaved. So in the conference they'd decided they didn't want anyone from Warburton. But my mother prayed, and my dear mother, she prayed that if it was to be the Lord's way, let Rosemary go. My dad didn't want me to go. He was his 17-year-old daughter going a long way to Sydney, because in those days as an Adventist girl, you wanted to train in the Adventist hospital, and we didn't have any. Well, we had the Warburton Sanitarium and Hospital, but they didn't train nurses. So it was a big step for Mum to let me go, because I'm one of 7 and I used to be very helpful to her. It meant she'd lose my support. And my dad was really upset. He thought it was far too far. Anyway, with the blessing of the Lord, he has plans we don't know anything about, doesn't he? Looking back sometimes I think, why did I leave Melbourne? I had family, I had aunts, I had uncles and everybody. But then I wouldn't have picked up a husband on the way if I hadn't. So up we drove all the way from Warburton to drop me off at the SAN. And the SAN seemed a very big place in those days for a country girl. But we lived in the nursing home in those days. You weren't allowed to get married or anything like that. You had to be married to the job. And I still see the old matron row there when I was there. Fortunately, none of you are much old enough to know who she was. She was a wonderful Christian, dedicated lady. But she said to us, you are married to the job. This is your whole life now. We're going to school you in nursing, and then you can go out into the community. So as my mum and dad drove away, I must admit I was the most scaredest person on this earth, in this very tight uniform, starched hat. You couldn't even walk. The starch in the uniform was so strong. And we had to wash and do those ourselves. But it was a very good training. Nursing today is a very different thing. Of course, nurses had to be recognised with a degree, because our course was only a diploma. And in the echelons of society, a diploma is not as good as a degree. I always said I had my degree in experience. But we had 4 years of training and on the job, which was a really good way of basis of learning about how to talk to people. Because we were cleaners to begin with, and we'd go into the patient's room with this great big automatic cleaner, bashing everything. But we learnt to talk to people. And this is how this shy person started to have a little bit more confidence. But the Lord is amazing, isn't he? He is with you if you believe, and he will help you. But I won't go on too long. But then, of course, I met my husband, and we had to be engaged for 2 years because you were thrown out of nursing if you got married. You weren't allowed to get married. But, you know, then after we came out this way, because my husband lived this way, and as I say, we gradually had children and got involved with Sabbath school and different things. But I'm sure those who've known me never thought that little quiet woman would ever stand up the front. But unfortunately, I lost my husband 24 years ago of a heart attack. He died suddenly. He was only 57. And after a couple of years, I was asked, would I like to be an elder? Well, I said, that's the last thing I want to be. Don't ask me, ask somebody else. And I can still see the pastor sitting in my kitchen. I thought he was joking, asking me would I like to be. Because elders to me were the conference ministers and leaders in the Signs Publishing Company, in the Warburton Hospital. They were a very important part of our church. But the Lord asks us in different ways, doesn't he, to do things. Everybody's got talents, but sometimes we've got to leave it to the Lord to help us improve those talents, hasn't he? It's no good being confident if you don't believe that the Lord is the one here really wanting to speak. As we face a brand new year, we do not know what lies ahead. We place ourselves in God's hands so that we may have the courage to serve others with his strength. In the new church year, which starts next month in February, you may be asked to do something that you don't have confidence to do. But pray about it, and the Lord can help. And he can use you even in the little things of life, can't he? Every part of the church is service. First of all, we like you here as congregation. It's no good being up the front if we've got no congregation, is it? All those who take part in the treasury and the deaconesses and deaconship, all in the running of the church, everyone has such an important role to play. And we're all different. And sometimes we've got to be careful not to be critical of each other, haven't we? But the Lord sees our heart. The Lord sees what we are asking of him, and he will grant it if he thinks it's right. So please, as we go into a brand new year, there will be evangelistic outreaches. There's quite a few plans that Pastor Janosch will share with you as time goes on. And even now, I often think, I'm too old. I don't want to do it anymore. I keep thinking, I don't feel my age, but you know when you look in the mirror and your mother's looking at you, you know very well that you are as old as that photo you've got there. I never thought I'd look like my mother, except I won't give up and I keep dyeing my hair. She had beautiful white hair and she lived to 94, so I better get working for the Lord. I've got a few more years, and I'd like to thank Maurice for his kind introduction this morning. And when I heard I was doing this service, I sent a message straight away to Maurice, and he said, Rosemary, I'll do everything. Whatever you want me to do. And what a blessing people in the church are. But I just hope that we can have an inspiration this morning, how Moses felt, who went on to be this great leader, didn't he? He led the children of Israel all the way to Canaan. And remember, Moses is not a saint. He's a sinner, just as we are. And it's only through our gracious Lord's love toward us, who's willing to forgive us if we're willing to put ourselves in his hand and recognise what we are. And I pray that this year in our church, we will want to work even better for the Lord. And I mean that for myself as well. Not always look at something and think, no, I don't want to do that. Before you think, well, if the Lord's asking me, perhaps he might help me to do it. Now, and if any of you like to do children's stories, please let me know, because I'd be happy for you to help out with the children's stories while I've got opportunity to ask you. It's not something that Rosemary has to do every week, but if you feel you'd like to do a children's story, please let me know, because I'm sure, like Maurice, we'd appreciate the help. And sometimes if you feel you could come up the front and take part in our divine program too, by helping out with the prayer. It all helps for the smooth running of God's house, which we want to give glory to him. The last hymn I've chosen today is actually, "O Jesus, I have promised." And if we make that promise, please help us keep it. "O Jesus, I have promised to serve thee to the end. Be thou forever near me, my master and my friend." And he will be there if we believe. And I'd ask you to stand, number 331.